It was a discovery born not of inquiry, but of exhaustion. Mark and Eliza Hayes had stopped noticing the dog 3 weeks into the endless cold snap of January 1884. It was just another piece of the suffering landscape, a lean grey wolf-dog mix, its ribs a washboard beneath a sparse coat. It appeared on the porch of their 16 by 20-foot claim shanty every morning, a silent frozen sentinel in the Dakota Territory's frozen dawn. They were burning $30 of cordwood a month, shipped in on the Northern Pacific, and still the water bucket froze solid 6 feet from the potbelly stove. Their neighbor, Thomas Grogan, his cabin a fortress of 18-inch logs, was burning nearly double that. He had the proper Minnesota build, a massive mortared stone hearth that consumed oak like a locomotive but left the corners of his room at a bitter 18 degrees Fahrenheit. His children were perpetually sick with chest colds. This was the accepted price of survival, but the dog was the anomaly. It would appear on the Hayes' porch as the sun rose, a pale disk in the ice-crystal sky. But it never whined, never begged. It simply waited. Then, around mid-morning, it would get up, stretch its skeletal frame and trot off, not into the woods for a rabbit, but directly toward the one structure everyone in the valley pitied, Silas Weir's sod house. Mark Hayes watched it go, baffled. One morning, with the temperature holding at a steady -22 degrees Fahrenheit, or -30 Celsius, Mark followed it. He kept his distance. The dog didn't go to Weir's door. It bypassed the low-slung structure and settled on a patch of bare earth 20 feet from the north wall, an area that should have been under 3 feet of impacted snow. The dog curled up on the dry, dusty ground and, in the lethal cold, went to sleep. Mark approached, his mittens pulled high. He knelt by the sleeping animal. He felt a wave of warmth. He pulled off a mitten, his skin stinging in the air, and pressed his palm to the dirt. It was not just thawed. It was inexplicable. Examples of proper cabins were plastered across the pages of the railroad pamphlets and settlement guides that had lured them all west. The year was 1884. The Dakota land boom, fueled by cheap acreage and boosterish promises of a temperate, dry climate from the Northern Pacific Railroad, was colliding with a brutal meteorological reality. The settlers, mostly Norwegians, Germans, and displaced New Englanders, had brought with them the architectural wisdom of their former homes. This wisdom was codified. You built with mass. You felled the thickest cottonwood or pine you could haul. A proper homestead cabin was a 16 by 20-foot box, with saddle-notched logs, a high-pitched roof to shed snow, and a massive stone fireplace on the north wall. This was the Ohio, or Pennsylvania style. The manuals instructed settlers to chink the gaps with oakum and daub, and to ensure the hearth was wide enough for a man to stand in. This was the accepted, celebrated, and only way. The fireplace was the symbol of the home, its roaring fire a psychological and physical bulwark against the wilderness. They built to fight the elements, to erect a fortress of timber against the wind. But the frontier was teaching them, slowly and painfully, that their fortresses were sieves and their methods were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. They had been in the Dakota Territory for less than 6 months. This flawed, conventional wisdom was perfectly embodied in Thomas Grogan's homestead. Grogan was a proud man, a former lumberman from Minnesota, and he had built his cabin by the book. It was a showpiece. He had used 18-inch diameter logs, perfectly notched. His stone fireplace was a masterpiece of mortar and river rock, 6 feet wide at the mouth. The cabin had cost him nearly $150 in hauled materials and glass, a significant sum for the time. It looked indestructible. It looked like the very picture of frontier success. But inside, it was a thermal disaster. Dr. Arbuthnot, a traveling physician and amateur meteorologist, had visited Grogan's wife, who was suffering from what they called lung fever or pneumonia. Arbuthnot had brought his instruments. When the outside temperature was a stable -20 degrees Fahrenheit, his certified thermometer, placed on the interior wall opposite the fire, registered 18 degrees Fahrenheit or -8 Celsius. The floor was a sheet of ice, save for a 6-foot radius around the hearth. The problem was the chimney itself. It was a massive, uninsulated bellows, drawing the heated air straight up and out. To feed its draft, it pulled freezing air in through every crack in the walls and floor. Grogan was burning a quarter cord of prime oak per day, and his family was slowly freezing to death, suffocating on the very air they were paying a fortune to heat. The fortress was, in thermodynamic terms, a death trap. Silas Weir, the owner of the soddy that attracted the wild dog, was not a farmer. He was a quiet, almost reclusive man in his late 50s, and he was Cornish. He had spent 30 years of his life not on the plains, but under them, in the copper and iron mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. His expertise was not in soil, but in geology, water seepage, and most importantly, ventilation. In the deep mines, Weir hadn't just managed air, he had managed heat. He understood firsthand the concept of the geothermal gradient, the immutable law that 10 feet below the frost line, the Earth maintains a constant year-round temperature of approximately 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 to 13 Celsius. He had watched Finnish miners build saunas that were marvels of efficiency, and he had studied the tile and brick Katchelofen masonry stoves of the German foremen, which seemed to heat a room for 8 hours on a handful of kindling. He saw the settlers building their cabins to fight the air, a battle of convection that consumed monstrous amounts of fuel. Weir believed the fight was pointless. One should not fight the air. One should cooperate with the earth. When he arrived, he ignored the plentiful timber in the river valley. He dug. His neighbors, Grogan chief among them, mocked him openly, calling his construction a pit house and saying the man was living like a badger. Weir's structure was, by all conventional standards, a failure. It was barely visible. He had used a horse-drawn scraper to dig a 3-foot deep, 20 by 20 foot square into a south-facing slope. The north wall of his home was the earth. The visible east, south and west walls were built not of expensive logs but of thick 3-foot by 1-foot sod blocks cut from the prairie itself. The roof was a low-pitched frame, layered with tar paper, his one significant expense, a foot of packed sod and then seeded with native prairie grass. It looked fragile, damp and primitive. The total cost of hauled materials, including a small glass pane for a single deep-set window and some iron for a stove door, was less than $20. But the most confusing element was the stove. There wasn't one. That is, there was no massive chimney, no stack of cordwood. All that was visible was a small brick and clay oven, like a pizza oven, built outside the main house, 10 feet away and slightly uphill. From this oven, a single 6-inch stovepipe ran, not up, but down, disappearing into the frozen ground. Grogan had seen it and laughed. Weir's folly, he called it. Man's trying to heat the whole damn prairie. The conflict was one of fundamental physics. Grogan's method was combative. It relied on brute force, burn massive amounts of fuel to create immediate, intense heat. This heat, primarily convective, was intended to fill a large, leaky wooden box. But air is a poor medium for storing heat. The moment the fire died down, the 18-degree mass of the log walls and the sub-zero air leaking through the cracks reclaimed the space. It was a system that required constant, massive energy input for marginal, localized returns. It was a battle of convection. Weir's method was cooperative, a system of conduction and radiation. His goal was not to heat the air in his home, but to heat the mass of his home. He used the 55-degree thermal mass of the planet as his primary insulator. His enemy was not the cold, it was heat loss. By digging into the earth, he eliminated wind and infiltration from 3 sides. His sod roof provided an R value, a measure of insulation 5 times that of Grogan's timber roof. But the masterstroke was the stove. He wasn't heating a box of air, he was charging a thermal battery. This was not a cabin, it was a carefully engineered heat sink, designed to capture and store energy, not to waste it. Dr. Arbuthnot, the physician, was the first to understand. Intrigued by Mark Hayes's story of the warm ground, he paid a formal visit to Silas Weir. He brought his black bag and his thermometers, expecting to find a delusional hermit. He entered the low door, stepping down into the main room. The air was not smoky. It was fresh, with a faint, clean smell of cured clay and dry grass. A small cast-iron stove, barely larger than a shoebox, sat in the corner, a tiny fire of willow wands glowing within. This, Weir explained, was his cook stove, separate from the main system. Arbuthnot was baffled. The ambient air temperature, measured by his certified thermometer, was 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 Celsius. It was uniform, the same in the corners as in the center. He placed a thermometer on the floor. The floor was hard-packed, oiled clay. It registered 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15.5 Celsius. Arbuthnot checked Weir's fuel pile. It was a meager stack of brush and willow branches. Weir explained in his quiet Cornish lilt that he fired his main stove, the outside one, for only 2 hours a day, 1 hour at dawn, 1 at dusk. The physician pulled out his notebook and did the math. Grogan, 200 pounds of oak per day, 18-degree interior walls, debilitating sickness. Weir, 30 pounds of brush per day, 64-degree ambient temperature, perfect health. The numbers didn't seem possible. Weir, seeing the doctor's genuine scientific confusion, finally explained the system. He called it his earthen lung. The outside stove was a high-efficiency masonry heater built of salvaged brick and clay. It was designed to burn a small amount of fuel very fast and very hot, reaching temperatures over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 540 Celsius. This intense, brief burn consumed all smoke and volatile gases. But the genius was in the exhaust. The 6-inch clay pipe didn't just disappear, it was a flue. It ran 3 feet under the cabin's packed clay floor. It was not a single pipe, but a network, laid in a serpentine switchback pattern, covering the entire 400-square-foot area of the floor. This was the impossible flue. The superheated 1,000-degree gas was channeled through this subterranean network. As it snaked its way under the floor, it slowly, steadily released its thermal energy, not into the air, but into a 12-inch bed of gravel and the thick 8-inch clay slab that formed the floor. By the time the exhaust gas completed its 80-foot journey and finally exited the system at that small, distant vent, the warm patch the wild dog had claimed, the gas was barely 150 degrees Fahrenheit, 65 Celsius. Weir had captured nearly 85% of the heat. The entire floor of his house was the radiator. It was a silent, massive, slow-release thermal battery. In late January 1885, the Great Blizzard struck. It was not a storm, but a meteorological invasion. A Siberian front stalled over the northern plains, and for 72 hours the territory ceased to exist under a howling 60-mile-per-hour wind that drove the real temperature down to -40 degrees, a point where Fahrenheit and Celsius converge. Wind chill was a concept they didn't have a word for, but they felt its power. Transportation stopped. Livestock froze, standing. Grogan's cabin became a tomb. They huddled around the fireplace, burning furniture and fence posts after the woodpile was buried. The pressure differential, caused by the wind and the massive chimney draft, blew the snow through the chinking. Grogan's thermometer broke when the mercury froze at the bottom of the tube. Dr. Arbuthnot would later estimate the internal temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, -12 Celsius. Mark and Eliza Hayes, in their flimsy shanty, retreated to their root cellar, a 6-by-6-foot pit, huddling with their stove. They were nearly overcome by carbon monoxide from the poor ventilation. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, Mark, half-frozen, dug his way out. His first thought was Silas Weir. He was sure the man was dead, his badger hole a frozen grave. Mark shoveled for an hour to find Weir's door, buried under an 8-foot drift. He finally tore it open, bracing himself for a frozen corpse. He was met with a wave of warm, dry air. Silas Weir was sitting at his small table, calmly repairing a harness by the light of his single window. His small internal cook stove was unlit. The air temperature, Mark would later recall, was a comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 Celsius. The packed clay floor was warm to the touch. Weir looked up, unsurprised. "Wicked one," he said, nodding toward the door. He explained that he had charged the floor with a 3-hour high heat burn just before the storm hit. The 50 tons of earth and clay forming his floor and walls had absorbed the heat, and the tons of earth around his house at a stable 55 degrees had insulated it. The storm raged for 72 hours. The thermal mass of his floor radiated gentle, silent heat for 90. That afternoon, Mark moved Eliza, her feet suffering from severe frostbite, into Weir's cabin. 2 days later, a near-delirious Thomas Grogan and his wife, carried by Dr. Arbuthnot, joined them. The tiny $20 sod house, built by the madman, became a field hospital for 5 people, all kept warm by the earthen lung. The blizzard was a harsh auditor, and its findings were undeniable. Dr. Arbuthnot wrote a scathing report on settler housing, which he sent to the Territorial Commission and the Dakota Pioneer newspaper. The report was less a medical document and more a technical manifesto. He included a table, now famous in regional history: Grogan cabin, standard method, SD fuel, 6 cords oak, interior temp, est, 10 degree B, occupants, severe frostbite. Weir cabin, subterranean flue, fuel, 0.5 cord willow jig brush, interior temp, puls 62 degree D, occupants healthy. The statistics were stark: survival versus death. When the spring thaw finally came, Thomas Grogan was the first to arrive at Silas Weir's door. He was not there to mock. He held a pencil and a notepad. He asked about the price of clay drainage pipe. By 1886, advertisements for patent subterranean heating flues appeared in the Fargo papers. The Northern Pacific Railroad, desperate to stop the reverse migration of settlers fleeing the climate, quietly commissioned Weir to draft a 10-page pamphlet, The Badger's Secret: How to Build a Warm House with No Fuel. It became the blueprint for the second wave of settlement. A photograph taken of that same valley in 1890 shows a profoundly different architecture. The tall, proud American log cabins are gone or have been relegated to barns and stables. The homesteads that dot the landscape are low-slung, earth-bermed structures, their sod roofs barely rising above the prairie grass, their single south-facing windows catching the low winter sun. The most visible features are the small, separate brick ovens and the distant steam-billowing vent pipes that mark the end of each home's earthen lung. Silas Weir's folly had become the territorial standard. The settlers who survived had learned, through the harsh lessons of the wind and the quiet instruction of a Cornish miner, what the wild dog had known all along. True shelter was not found in fighting the sky, in a battle of mass against the wind. It was found in cooperation with the earth, in understanding the quiet, constant and life-giving warmth held just beneath the frozen soil.